This week on Book Talk, our guests are Dr. Blaine Everson and Chaplain Darren Chester. Dr. Everson will be joining us on Skype, and Chaplain Chester will join us in the studio a little bit later in the program. I'm your host, Dr. Richard Long. Families Under Fire is a book about systemic therapy in military families. It's divided into three sections. The first one being an overview of family systems in the military. The second section of the book is on systemic interventions for specific military subgroups. And the third is for support members of service family members. Dr. Everson is a clinical director at the Samaritan Counseling Center in Northeast Georgia. He's an instructor in the Department of Clinical and Family Development at the University of Georgia and co-editor with Dr. Charles Figley, a pioneer in the field of modern trauma study of Families Under Fire. Dr. Everson, welcome to today's Book Talk.
Thank you, Richard.
Dr. Everson, what led the two of you to co-edit a book called Families Under Fire?
Well, at the time we were thinking about it, it would have been in probably the middle around 2005, 2006. There just wasn't a whole lot clinically available to people, especially for civilians who were practicing on or near military posts. So what we had intended to do was to create a book, a source book or a guidebook for people who were civilians who were unfamiliar with military culture, some way that they could work with military families, particularly Army and Marine and Air Force families.
And we've taken a look at two or three of the reviews on the book. They're very positive. One in particular that stood out came from Dr. Brett Moore. He's editor of his own book on treating PTSD in military personnel, and he said about your book, this book should be on the shelf of every clinician who works with service members and their families. Dr. Everson, what is it about military families that you find them a good subject for a book?
They're very exciting to see in clinical practice. I enjoy the stimulation of seeing military families because some of their problems are further complicated by the long-term separations associated with deployment, the frequent moves that they experience when they relocate, and also a lot of blended and step families situations. So there's always something to do with these individuals, and it isn't your run-of-the-mill everyday clinical practice in a sleepy southern town.
Okay, so it requires a lot of flexibility and a lot of abilities to think on a variety of different levels to serve those families, for sure.
Yes.
Another reviewer, Dr. Kenyon Knapp in the Department of Counseling at Mercer, says the book's a treasure of insights in the military families and would benefit any sort of fledgling graduate student or even the most seasoned practitioner. I'm curious, have you gotten some feedback from either seasoned practitioners or graduate students about your book?
Well, I was actually at Mercer in Atlanta last week, and what we had a number of licensed professional counselors and social workers and Samaritan family therapists there as well. What I'm getting, and they ranged from having practiced a number of years and from just having practiced a few years. What I found was that all of the people who were there, regardless of whether they had very little or no military experience with in clinical practice, or a great deal of clinical experience in practice with military families. What I found was that everybody had something to say about the book. I mean, in terms of their exposure to it, that there's something in there for everyone.
Yeah,
and basically is what I'm hearing.
You use the resources of a lot of experts. Could you sort of talk about two or three of the experts? How did you find them, and what sort of makes them uniquely qualified to contribute to a book like this?
Well, we found them just sometimes people we knew already. Charles knew and I knew, and sometimes we would meet people at conferences or workshops. There would be word of mouth. Sometimes somebody would say, hey, I'm not interested in doing anything, or I've got too much on my plate right now, but you should contact so-and-so. And then that's, for example, the chapter on emotionally focused couple therapy with Army, within the Army. Colonel Sneath was actually recommended to me by somebody completely different, another individual in the chaplaincy service that I had come across and had contact with. Lynn Hall, of course, is a very well-known therapist and counselor with military families. And she has wrote her own book that I reviewed for Rutledge several years ago on counseling military families, and so it actually preceded mine by a couple of years. So I just feel like there were a number of we tried to draw from as wide of a variety of clinicians across disciplines as we possibly could.
Yeah, and you certainly accomplished that. What sort of impact were you hoping for in editing a book like this?
I guess we were primarily just wanting to give people a sense of systems, a better idea, a notion of family systems, and how it is applied to practice with mental health, or with military families. Professional counselors tend to deal individual, psychologists tend to deal with individual problems or problems on a one-to-one basis. Social workers tend to do a little bit more community-wide work, trying to find resources for people in trouble or crisis. What we wanted to do was really focus specifically on military families, and have people get a better understanding that there is an entire set of principles and protocols for dealing with families in a therapeutic context.
Certainly makes a lot of sense. One of the other reviewers that I found fascinating was Dr. Richard Swartz, and he's the developer of internal family systems, and he created a model for psychotherapy. He says the book is an invaluable resource for those of us who want to know what we're doing with this especially distressed population, which brings me then to want to introduce to you my second guest for today's program, Chaplain Darren Chester. He's a Family Life Center chaplain at Fort Benning. He's a graduate student in our community counseling program at Columbus State, and I want to be able to welcome you and welcome him to today's book talk. Chaplain Chester. On the set is Chaplain Chester. Chaplain works with couples at Fort Benning. And Chaplain Chester, you had an opportunity to read the book. Did anything particularly resonate with you in the work you to do on the Post?
Well, a lot of it did. I appreciated especially Chapter 2, which I thought gave a very good summary of the distinctiveness of military life for therapists. And I was wondering for Dr. Everson, this book would be an excellent way to inform therapists that work with the military about the distinctiveness of military life. Have you thought of other ways that therapists might be trained in this material as well?
Well, at this time, I'm on a national work group across disciplines for people who are anticipating the return of veterans from the long-term wars, to develop some background and some specifics on what people might need in order to be able to practice with military families. So I've given a lot of thought to what civilian practitioners need, and I think in the next 5 years it'll be equally as important to be able to say, since a lot of people will be returning from warfare and needing services, I think it's going to be even more important that practitioners have some sense of what military life was like or is like for people still who may still be in the military.
Yeah, absolutely. The mental health services of our forces are just being overwhelmed right now, and they're having to put a lot of people out into the civilian sector for the help that they need. So I think this book is coming at a very valuable time, and it'll be an excellent resource for those practitioners.
Well, I was going to say, even with the VA, I get referrals from the VA because they don't do family or couple work, and so having been identified as a veteran-friendly therapist in and around this area, I get a good number of referrals. So I still kind of keep my foot in it that way, or keep my toe in it that way, I guess.
Yeah. Dr. Everson, you mentioned working with couples, and Chaplain Chester, I wondered with you, Was there anything in particular in that chapter on couples that kind of rang true for you on your work?
Yes, I thought it was very insightful to give the therapist some idea of the different types of stresses, the very unique stresses that couples undergo. And one of the things that resonated with me in Chapter 3 especially, Dr. Everson recognized, and this is kind of a very unique thing among couples, but when soldiers come back from overseas, oftentimes they feel a need to reward themselves with some sort of a gift they buy for themselves, and I've seen that result in a great deal of independent behavior and independent decision-making between couples. And for instance, if a soldier goes out and buys a new truck after his deployment to reward himself for that deployment, Dr. Everson, is that something that you have seen as well in your own practice, the fallout from that sort of independent decision-making?
It was, to be honest with you, that in Chapter 3, there was the case that I decided not to include was a couple that their first big fallout or big blow up after he returned was that he went out and bought a set of rims, spinning, the ones that spin, and he just had to have those rims, and she didn't feel like they needed to have them. So yes, I've seen plenty of that on numerous occasions, and that particular case almost got it was written up and it almost got included in the book, but the one on the cyber life, the online affair was much more. That one kind of came to me late, and I was like, I got to put this in the book. That's all there is to it. So there's nothing like this out there.
That was the question I had of Chaplain Chester, and that is that whole business of you mentioned independence and in some ways privilege coming back, which also then creates in some cases a cyber wife or cyber spouse. Are you seeing that phenomena? Is it distressing? And what have you found in the book that's kind of helpful with regard to that whole sort of surreal cyber life that couples sometimes have in the military?
Dr. Everson mentioned a particular case study that he put in his book that dealt around that issue. And I believe that that's probably a more common issue for couples in the military to experience. It's simply because when they're deployed, they've got more time, they've got the resources that they need to kind of engage in a second life in the cyber world online. And I've seen a lot of couples that have just experienced a great deal of distress because of that. And so, have you seen a higher incidence of that, you think, Dr. Everson, of couples living a second cyber life because of the military deployments?
That was the only case that I'd seen. That was an extreme case, so I included that. Online inappropriate relationships online are not uncommon in those kinds of things. The other chapter that I thought that I liked with couples was Colonel Sneath's chapter on emotionally focused couples, and Kathy Ring's chapter. And I think that was they were dealing with a different approach, I think, because we were looking at structural strategic interventions with Army couples, and they were looking at another, and I jumped at the chance to include that chapter. Did you have a chance to look at that?
Yes, I did. And Chaplain Sneath was directing a program of which I'm a part right now. He was out at Fort Hood. But I've become more interested in this emotional focus therapy since I've been here at Columbus State and learning how to use it. And I see it as a very valuable tool in helping treat our couples and families and even individuals that are really having a hard time with their deployment experiences, the PTSD and combat type trauma. And one question I guess I had for you is, one thing they mentioned in that chapter, I believe, is how there's a positive correlation between an individual having a good relationship with someone that they can share their experiences with and their ability to heal from combat trauma. And the old non-commissioned officers used to say to soldiers, if we wanted you to have a wife in the Army, we would have issued you one. Mm-hmm. Just that observation would tell me that a wife, if you have a good relationship with your spouse, can be an excellent resource for someone who's dealing with some of the issues that surround combat trauma and PTSD, if they have that good relationship.
Well, I guess one of the things is there is that separation, and I talked some about, I don't know if it's, I've been talking more recently about first order family and second order family, And second order family certainly includes unit mates and people within that are in the club, so to speak, rather than spouses and children and other relatives. And that's there has been a sense, I guess it's part of the culture, that keeping those things to yourself or among the brethren, so to speak, is more the way to go. And I'm seeing that change, I guess, and that was one of the reasons that I wanted to include Chaplain Sneath's chapter in the book, because he really does present a very good case and some very strong case illustrations for just that.
Another area that's talked about is spirituality, and Chaplain Chester, there's a discussion about the damage to the soul that occurs during combat experiences. Wonder, is there anything in that chapter that stood out for you?
Yes, it did. I thought that was a very well-written chapter by Dr. Brody. Very insightful. He has a great grasp on spirituality in the soldier. Very insightful understanding of how the chaplaincy operates within the military as well. One of the things that I've learned that he brought out, I thought, in his chapter, were two things that can really protect a person spiritually, their spiritual life, when they're in combat. And that's, number one, a very well-developed sense of meaning that transcends a person's own self, and also a very well-developed, what I call theodicy or theology of evil. That's something that can really shipwreck many people's faith. And Dr. Everson, do you have a perspective on how therapists can help warriors heal from the damage to the soul that occurs during wartime?
I think part of it is just being present. I think about the fact that I've not felt the sting of combat myself, and sometimes I early on in my work I felt that I really had no way of connecting with people, and I found that just sitting with them and listening to them and honoring what they were saying and talking through and letting them talk through what had happened was the best way to do that. Alan, Dr. Baruti, does a lot of work with self-care with chaplains at their center over in Hinesville. So that one of the things that I really, and the importance of self-care and combating fatigue, compassion fatigue, as you continue to delve into this work is very important. Mm-hmm. I think, like I said, I think just for civilians, and that's where I'm coming from, is that just honoring what has happened. I mean, some people, and I tell people this in workshops all the time, some people can't do this work. They are morally opposed to everything that maybe the military stands for. And my suggestion is don't do it. I mean, do something else. Do something, find something else that you're interested in. I'm just still terribly interested in this.
Yeah. The other issue that comes up is forgiveness. And Chaplain Chester, I wonder, do you see any connection between that sort of inability to forgive and PTSD?
Yes, I do. I think a lot of our soldiers that come home that experience symptoms like PTSD or are diagnosed with PTSD are really dealing with a lot of guilt. There are a variety of things that can cause guilt in the soldier. Some of them are guilty just because they survived their experiences. Some of them are guilty because of the damage they see to their families. Some feel guilty for simply enjoying life after combat or for not agreeing with the justness of the war. So I think that guilt and the theme of forgiveness is very important for therapists to focus on when it comes to the soul of the warrior.
I would agree with that 100%, and that's there is if you're familiar with any of Edward Tick's work on how the soul is affected by war and how forgiveness plays into that, I think Alan talks a good bit about that, or at least talks about that at some point in that particular chapter. Ed's going to actually be in Atlanta again as the guest of a group called Veterans Heart Georgia before long, and so it would be something that I certainly plan to try to go see him, and I recommend for a lot of people to be able to do that. I think his book is called War in the Soul. I don't necessarily mean to plug Ed's book, but he has a very deep understanding of how war affects people in a very deep way.
Speaking of books, you have a new one that you're working on?
Yeah, we're trying to get together. It's called War, Families, and Society, and what we're looking at is kind of what I was talking about earlier, trying to put together I'm going to actually do less writing in it this time. And we're trying to put together a book across disciplines of people who are some practitioners and some people who are academicians, and some people who are in the military or former military, who just to look at what we should expect as a society with people returning from warfare, for protracted warfare for the past decade, and what's going on, what's going to be, how that's going to impact not only our families but our communities and the society at large. And so it's going to be more of a family studies, family science focused book rather than specifically a therapeutic, specifically for therapists.
Right. Obviously, another major contribution to work with military families on its way. Dr. Everson, thank you very much for joining us this week on Book Top. We've reviewed the work of Dr. Blaine Everson, co-editor with Dr. Charles Figley of Families Under Fire. Joining me in the studio has been Chaplain Darren Chester. Thank you for joining us, and I'm Dr. Richard Long.